Here's a question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why almost nobody saw this target coming. For years, whenever people talked about the B-2 and Iran in the same sentence, they pictured one thing: buried bunkers, nuclear tunnels, mountains full of centrifuges. That's the story everyone's been trained to expect from this aircraft. And honestly, it's the story I expected too. But a few weeks ago, a B-2 crew flew a mission against something that isn't buried at all, isn't a bunker, and by most independent accounts, wasn't even on anyone's public target list a year ago. A bridge. Not a metaphor, not a symbolic target. An actual reinforced highway bridge spanning a river valley in western Iran. And by every early account, the strike worked exactly the way it was supposed to. So why would the most expensive, most exotic strike aircraft on the planet get sent after a piece of civil infrastructure instead of a hardened nuclear facility? Stick around, because that question is a lot more interesting. I mean, a lot more consequential than it sounds. And the answer touches everything, from missile logistics to targeting doctrine, to why some targets matter more for what crosses them than for what they're actually made of. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for a long time, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I spend my time breaking down military aviation stories like this one, pulling in real reporting and technical documentation rather than just repeating whatever headline is trending that day. And today's story genuinely surprised me, which doesn't happen often anymore covering this war. So let's get into the actual details, starting with what we know with reasonable confidence, before we get to the part that's still genuinely unresolved. Everyone knows the B-2's signature weapon by now, the GBU-57, the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator that punched through Fordo last year. That mission is the one people picture whenever this aircraft comes up. A weapon built to bury itself through roughly 200 feet of earth, or reinforced concrete, before a smart fuse detonates it exactly where it'll do the most damage, deep enough underground that the blast does far more damage to a buried structure than the same explosive would ever manage detonating on the surface. That's the profile everyone expects, and it's a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering. But the B-2 was never built to carry only that one bomb. It's a flexible platform with a large internal weapons bay that's been configured to carry a wide range of ordnance since the aircraft first entered service decades ago. And on this particular mission, the reporting that has surfaced points to a much more conventional payload: precision-guided JDAMs in the 2,000-pound class, the kind that detonate on or near impact rather than needing to bury themselves first. Because this target didn't need penetration. Concrete and rebar aren't granite. What it needed was precision, timing, and enough stealth to get a crew there and back without being detected until the job was already done. The bridge itself sits in a river valley that, for years, barely registered on anyone's radar as a strategic location. It's not near a nuclear site. It's not near a known missile base. On paper, it looks like exactly what it appears to be: a regional transport link connecting a handful of smaller towns to the country's main highway network. But satellite analysts had flagged unusual activity there months before the strike ever happened. Convoy movement at irregular overnight hours, well outside the normal patterns you'd expect from commercial freight. Trucks heavier than the load rating posted for that stretch of road, sometimes forcing brief closures for what local reporting described only as maintenance. Escort vehicles trailing certain convoys but not others, which is the kind of detail that doesn't show up on a normal supply run and tends to catch the attention of anyone reviewing that imagery closely. The working theory, and I want to be very clear, this is a theory pieced together from open-source satellite imagery and inference, not a confirmed operational fact, is that this crossing had quietly become one of only a small number of routes capable of moving completed ballistic missile components from an inland assembly site toward a dispersed launch network further south. cut that bridge, and you don't destroy a missile. You strand it somewhere it can't be launched from, at least not on schedule. That's a fundamentally different kind of target than anything we've talked about with this program before, and it's worth sitting with exactly why. A bunker is a fixed problem. It's hard to reach, but it's static. The target isn't going anywhere, and the entire fight is about whether your weapon can physically get to it and survive long enough to detonate where it matters. A bridge is a moving problem, wearing the disguise of a static one. Its value doesn't come from the concrete itself. It comes from what depends on that concrete still being there when something needs to cross it. Hit it at the wrong moment, and the other side just reroutes through an alternate crossing a day later, and you've spent an enormously expensive mission on almost nothing. Hit it at exactly the right moment, with the right convoy caught mid-span or approaching the deck. And you're not just delaying a weapon system by a few days. You're potentially removing hardware from the field entirely, with no easy way to recover it, and no way to quietly pretend it never happened. And that timing question is exactly where this story stops being a simple headline about a bombed bridge and starts being genuinely interesting. Because striking infrastructure like this isn't primarily a targeting decision, it's an intelligence decision. Somebody had to be confident enough in that traffic pattern, confident enough in what was actually crossing that specific span on that specific night, to justify sending one of the most closely guarded, most expensive aircraft in the American inventory across contested airspace for a target that, on paper, looks almost mundane next to a nuclear tunnel complex under a mountain. That's a genuinely different kind of pressure on the people making the call than deciding to strike a facility everyone already agrees is a legitimate high-value target. Munitions analysts who've reviewed the limited public reporting on this are genuinely split on how to read it, and I think both readings are worth laying out, because neither one is unreasonable. One reading: this was a low-risk, high-confidence strike, using a soft, undefended target to produce a hard strategic effect, degrading Iran's ability to physically move missile hardware around the country without needing anywhere near the enormous mission profile a GBU-57 strike against a mountain requires. Under that reading, this is actually the efficient version of the B-2 mission, not the dramatic one, and arguably a more cost-effective use of a scarce airframe than repeatedly sending it after the hardest possible targets. The other reading, and this is the one that's generated more pushback among people who track this closely, is that hitting infrastructure this specific, this quickly after unusual activity was first noticed, suggests a level of intelligence access inside Iran's internal logistics network that goes well beyond satellite photography, something closer to real-time human or signals intelligence tracking specific convoys as they move. Neither claim has been independently confirmed by anyone with actual access, and I want to be upfront that anyone telling you with total confidence which one is true right now is guessing, however many credentials come after their name. So what actually happens next if this really was a logistics strike, rather than a one-off opportunity that presented itself and got taken? There are really only a couple of realistic paths from here, and I think this is exactly where the story stops being about one bridge and starts being about an entire strategic approach. The first path is that this becomes a pattern rather than an isolated event, a rolling campaign against choke points specifically, bridges, tunnel approaches, rail crossings, anywhere missile components have to funnel through one narrow, identifiable physical space, using conventional ordnance instead of the rare, high-visibility bunker busters that require the full 30-hour Missouri round trip every single time. That's a far more sustainable operational tempo for a B-2 fleet that's genuinely small, a couple dozen airframes total, and simply cannot be everywhere at once dropping 30,000-pound bombs on mountains while also handling every other mission the war demands. Under that path, expect to see this exact kind of strike show up again, on a different bridge or a different choke point entirely, probably without much warning. The second path is a lot less dramatic, and honestly, It's probably the more likely one given how these decisions tend to actually get made in practice. This was a single, high-confidence strike based on a narrow, fleeting intelligence window that presented itself once, not the deliberate opening move of a broader interdiction campaign. Militaries generally don't build entire campaigns around a single successful strike without a lot more evidence that the approach scales. And logistics targets like this one depend on intelligence windows that don't necessarily reopen on command. Under that version, the bridge matters less as evidence of a new strategy and more as a signal on its own, proof that nothing in Iran's supply chain is genuinely safe from interdiction anymore, whether it's buried 300 feet under granite or sitting in plain sight over a river that satellites pass above every single day. I want to flag something else here because I think it actually explains why this particular story spread the way it did once it surfaced. Nobody announced this strike ahead of time. There was no radio interview, no public naming of the target before the mission flew, the way we've seen with some of the larger, more symbolic nuclear sites this year. This one only surfaced afterward, pieced together from flight tracking data out of Whiteman Air Force Base, and local reporting on a suddenly impassable river crossing, which is actually the more traditional, more historically normal way these kinds of strikes have come to light, long before target names ever started showing up in radio interviews. And that quieter rollout is itself informative. It suggests this wasn't primarily designed as a pressure tactic aimed at forcing Iran back toward a negotiating table, the way publicly naming a nuclear target ahead of time often is. It reads much more like a strike that was meant to actually work quietly, rather than to be seen working loudly, which is a genuinely different communication strategy than the one we've watched play out around some of the more high-profile nuclear targets this year. It's also worth thinking about what this means for the B-2 crews actually flying these missions, because that part rarely gets discussed, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Every GBU-57 mission out of Whiteman requires that full 30-plus-hour round trip with multiple aerial refuelings, an enormous tanker logistics chain supporting the route the entire way, and an extraordinarily narrow margin for error given how few airframes exist to begin with. A JDAM-based strike against a conventional target doesn't remove that burden entirely. The aircraft still has to fly the same distance and survive the same contested, layered air defenses along the way. But it does mean the mission doesn't require the same razor-thin precision, repeated strike after strike into a single ventilation shaft that a mountain target demands. In a strange way, a bridge might actually be an easier mission to execute successfully than a mountain, even though it sounds like the less impressive target on paper. And that gap between perceived difficulty and actual difficulty is part of why this story caught people off guard. It's worth walking through exactly what a mission like this looks like end to end, because I think the sheer scale of it gets lost when the headline is just, "Bridge Destroyed." A B-2 launching out of Whiteman for a target in western Iran is still looking at a round trip well into the double digits of flight hours, with multiple aerial refuelings along the way, even though this target sits closer to friendly airspace than a facility like Fordo does. The aircraft still has to cross the same layered air defense network, still has to maintain the same radar cross-section discipline the entire way in, and still has to egress without leaving any signature behind that would tip off exactly which asset was responsible before the crew is safely home. None of that changes just because the payload this time was a handful of conventional JDAMs instead of a specialized bunker-penetrating weapon. If anything, some analysts have pointed out that a lower-profile target like a bridge might actually demand more discretion on approach, since the entire value of the strike depends on it looking, at least initially, like an unexplained infrastructure failure, rather than an obvious military action, buying a window before Iran can even confirm publicly what happened or respond to it. There's also a historical pattern worth mentioning here, because interdiction strikes against bridges and transport infrastructure are hardly a new idea in modern warfare. They go back decades, long before stealth aircraft existed at all, precisely because cutting a supply route has always been cheaper and often more effective than trying to destroy every individual piece of equipment that depends on it. What's new here isn't the concept, it's the platform. Using an aircraft this expensive, this rare, and this specialized for a mission type that historically didn't require anything close to that level of capability tells you something about how contested Iranian airspace has actually become over the course of this war. A less exotic aircraft simply might not have survived the approach to a target sitting this far inland, which means the choice of platform here is, in its own way, just as informative as the choice of target. There's also a question worth asking that doesn't get nearly enough attention in coverage like this. What happens to the crew that flew it? A B-2 mission this deep into contested territory, even against a comparatively soft target, still puts 2 people inside one of the most heavily tracked, most valuable aircraft in the entire American inventory for the better part of a day. There's no ejecting into friendly territory if something goes wrong over western Iran, and there's no backup airframe sitting nearby if the mission has to be aborted partway through. Every one of these flights is a genuinely high-stakes undertaking, regardless of whether the payload is a specialized bunker buster or a handful of conventional bombs. And I think that's easy to lose sight of when the story gets reduced to a single sentence about a bridge going down. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because I don't think this strike happened in a vacuum. Throughout this war, the B-2 and its most powerful weapon have been reserved almost exclusively for the handful of targets that genuinely need that level of capability, while more common, more expendable munitions and more widely available aircraft have handled everything else happening around them at the same time. That division of labor keeps the rarest, most expensive asset focused on exactly the job only it can do. And a bridge strike using conventional bombs from a B-2 looks, at first glance, like it breaks that pattern. But it may actually reinforce a version of it, using the platform's stealth specifically, rather than its bunker-busting payload, for a mission that genuinely required getting a crew in and out of contested airspace undetected, which is a capability nothing else in the American arsenal can quite match either. Now, before you take any of this as settled fact, I want to give you the same caution I try to build into every one of these breakdowns, because on a story like this, it genuinely matters more than usual. The exact cargo that was crossing that bridge, the precise scale of disruption to Iran's missile logistics network, the exact intelligence method that identified the timing window, all of that is currently built from satellite imagery, flight tracking data, and unnamed sourcing, not confirmed operational fact, released by anyone with direct access to the mission itself. Reputable outlets are consistent on the broad strokes. A B-2 struck a bridge tied to suspected missile logistics activity, and by available reporting, the strike succeeded in taking that crossing out of service for at least some meaningful stretch of time. But the more specific a claim gets from here, an exact convoy count, an exact missile variant supposedly involved, an exact intelligence source behind the timing, the more skeptical you should be until it's independently corroborated by more than one outlet working from separate information rather than repeating the same original leak. I also want to address the elephant in the room for anyone who's been following this war closely. Why hasn't Tehran said more about this publicly? Part of the answer is probably straightforward. Admitting that a critical logistics route for missile components got taken out in a single quiet strike isn't exactly a message any government wants to volunteer, especially in the middle of an active conflict where every admission of vulnerability becomes ammunition for the other side's messaging. But part of it might also be genuinely strategic silence, the kind of calculated non-response that avoids confirming exactly what the bridge was being used for in the first place, which would only give outside analysts more to work with. Either way, the near-total absence of an official Iranian statement on this particular strike, compared to the much louder public reaction to some of the earlier nuclear site strikes this year, is itself a data point worth factoring in, even if it's one that cuts in more than one possible direction, depending on how you choose to read it. So where does that actually leave us today? The United States has already proven, more than once, that its most specialized bunker buster works exactly as designed against Iran's deepest, hardest targets, first at Fordo and Natanz, then against underground facilities elsewhere in the country. Both of those were genuine successes by most available reporting, with little ambiguity about the outcome. This strike proves something genuinely different, that the same stealth platform, the same crews, the same aircraft, can be pointed at something far more mundane-looking and still produce a strategically meaningful effect without needing the biggest weapon in the arsenal at all. Whether this becomes the opening move of a broader logistics interdiction campaign against Iran's supply routes, or stays a single well-timed strike that doesn't repeat, is genuinely one of the more interesting open questions coming out of this war right now. And it's one I'll be tracking closely as more reporting comes out over the next few weeks. And there's one more layer to this worth sitting with before we move on. If this really does turn out to be the first strike in a longer campaign against Iran's logistics network, rather than an isolated event, it changes the calculus for anyone trying to move anything sensitive around the country going forward, not just missile components specifically. Once a target category shifts from probably safe because it's not obviously military to apparently on the table, that uncertainty itself becomes a weapon, forcing more caution, more delay, and more exposure with every subsequent movement, regardless of whether another strike ever actually happens again. If you're trying to follow this yourself going forward, here's what I'd actually watch for. Keep an eye on flight tracking data out of Whiteman specifically, since any repeat activity along a similar route is going to leave a trail well before it's officially confirmed by anyone. The same way tanker orbits and unusual endurance flight patterns have tipped off other missions before they were announced. Watch satellite imagery updates from open-source analysts tracking road and bridge repair efforts in western Iran, because how fast and how visibly Iran moves to rebuild that crossing will tell you almost as much about its actual importance as the original strike did. And watch whether any similar infrastructure, other bridges, other choke points, gets hit in the coming weeks. Because that's the clearest possible sign this was the beginning of a pattern rather than a single isolated decision that won't be repeated. It's a genuinely open question, and one that I think matters more than most people following this war casually would assume just from the size of the headline it generated, given how much bigger and more dramatic the mountain and bunker stories tend to look on the surface. Alright, 3 things before you go, because I want you to actually get something out of this beyond just watching. And each one of these takes about 5 seconds. First, if breakdowns like this, actually walking through the strategy and the logistics behind a story, instead of just reacting to a scary headline, are useful to you, subscribe and turn notifications on right now before you move to the next video, because this story is genuinely still developing, and I don't want you to miss it when it does. This is exactly the kind of thing that could develop further with almost no warning. Second, drop a comment right now before you forget, and tell me whether you think this was a one-off strike or the start of a broader campaign against Iran's supply routes. I read every single one of these, and it genuinely helps me figure out what to dig into next. And third, if this is the first video you've watched on this war, go check out the breakdown covering how the GBU-57 has actually been used across this entire conflict from the very beginning. It'll give you the fuller picture that makes everything in this video make even more sense. The two really work best watched back to back. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. And it's a genuinely interesting story, and I think it's exactly the kind worth taking the time to actually understand, instead of just skimming a headline about it. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.